who's the players? Or if we want to be stuffy economists, we call them agents. Who's the players in the loanable funds market? Who do we got? The government. Who else, Michael? Banks. Who else? Individuals. Those individuals can be in a household, so that's our normal, everyday, average Joe human beings there. And businesses. Okay, so there's kind of our players in the marketplace. Now, if you go back to our market system here with the government in play, that identifies simply our players right here, right? We've got households, businesses, of which some of those businesses are banks, by the way. So there's kind of a unique relationship there where they're on kind of both sides of the fence. But banks are over here too. They're just another private company. And then the government. So there's our three agents. And all of these players can be borrowing or essentially loaning funds. So that's an important distinction to note. All players could be borrowers or savers. We saw this when we started off the macro material in chapter 4. The very first material I hit was sources of funds and uses of funds. And what did we learn about borrowing and saving at the big scale? What's that? They cancel out, right? So on the big scale, what somebody is borrowing is what somebody else is lending, right? They have to equal each other. So that's another thing to take away from this, is that in a given time frame, like 2013, the government could be a borrower, which they definitely are in a big way in 2013. Believe it or not, there's been points in our history where the government has been a saver, though. They've actually collected more money than what they've spent. So that happens once in a while, too. So all players could be borrowers or savers, but in aggregate, let's start to throw those big words around. After adding up everybody, in aggregate, borrowing must equal saving. Borrowing must equal saving. Is borrowing and saving a flow variable or a stock variable? Stock, flow. I hear some answers of both. So what is it?
You say borrowing and saving?
Borrowing and saving both, yes. So if you borrow money, what do we say you are? What's your status? If you borrowed more money than you made, at the end of the year you have some debt. Is debt a stock variable or a flow variable? Stock. What's what? Which one has meaning at a point in time and which one is over a period of time? Stock is at a point in time. So right now, today, what is today? March 1st, right? I got the 29th on my watch, but I know that's not right. Okay, so we got March 1st at 11:34. You guys could all take an inventory of your debt, right? And it has meaning. Some of you are $5,000 in debt. Some of you might be a lot more. But 5,000 has meaning. All right. How did you get $5,000 in debt? What did you do the last 3 years? you borrowed, right? So the borrowing is the flow variable, the stock variable is the debt. So each year, each time period, you borrow money, and if you continue to borrow without paying it back, your debt grows. So our bucket concept would be we've got some debt, and what's flowing into the bucket is some borrowing. Borrowing is the flow variable. The stock variable is the debt. There's a hole in the bucket because over a time period there's another flow, a leaky bucket, because you paid off some debt. You might have borrowed some more too, but you paid off one credit card, but you ramped it up on a different credit card or something like that, right? So then there's this net effect. How much new borrowing did I do over the course of the year versus how much did I pay off? So this is pay off debt, or pay off some. Pay off some debt. So these are your flow variables, your stock variables, debt. Same thing with saving. Now saving's a little bit trickier because we think about, well, what's my savings account? The savings account is a stock variable. So if you have $100 in your account, that means something at a point in time. But then we also say, well, I saved some money at the grocery store. I had a coupon, and I saved some money. And then we've got other savings that go on to say this year I saved $20. I had savings of 100, so now I have 120. So saving gets sloshed around. I'm talking about the language that we use when we communicate with each other. Gets a little sloppy when it comes to saving. And it's important to have those concepts down. So what you're really talking about here is your wealth. How much wealth do you have is determined by how much you save each year. So if you save money, your wealth grows, right? And so at a point in time, you can be more wealthy. Those accountants out there, and maybe some other people, what is wealth? How do you calculate your wealth if you're an individual? Tell me the hoops that you go through, the little formula you work through to calculate your wealth. John? Sum of all your assets minus your liabilities. So there's two parts to that. The value of your assets minus the value of your liabilities. So if you own a laptop and you own a car and you've got $7,000 worth of assets, but you still got $2,000 left on the car, but you own the laptop in full, $7,000 minus the $2,000 debt gives you $5,000 worth of wealth. So wealth is the value of assets minus the value of all your debts or liabilities. That's not looking too good here. Wealth equals assets minus liabilities. I like to put the word value in there because I don't want you to forget that it's a dollar value of those things. That's your wealth over time. So we kind of mixed in some stock variables and some flow variables. Over the course of the year, those people who ultimately saved some money and deferred consumption, that's going to be equal to the amount of borrowing that was done by somebody else. So somebody might be going in debt, but somebody's building wealth. Those two things cancel with each other in a given time period. All right, questions or comments on that? All right, so let's list out these three agents here. Households. Households tend to be net savers in the aggregate. Households are net savers in aggregate. If I take all of the people in our nation and add them up, more people are saving than going into debt. That's good news on net. So households are net savers in aggregate. So what that means is more people save than go into debt. This would include all kinds of things. Credit cards, which are unsecured loans. We got secured loans, usually your car, house. Those are types of things that households borrow for. So anytime we're taking on some sort of consumer debt, unsecured or secured, that's one piece of the puzzle. Questions on that one? All right, businesses. Businesses are net borrowers. In the loanable funds market, they tend to borrow more funds. They borrow more funds than they save. Government. Net borrower or net saver? Borrower. Net borrower. Traditionally, at least in the United States, there's other governments that are not doing that. Part of what's on the table right now is they're sequestering time to figure out, are we going to spend more money, are we not going to spend more money? So they are looking at their equation. They're a net borrower. So we can think about how they borrow money. What goes on that causes them to have to borrow money? Might help to think back to this picture. What causes the government to have to borrow money in a given time frame? Remember, borrowing is a flow variable. So what causes the government in this year, 2013, to have to borrow money? What are they doing? Taxes related to nope, we'll just leave imports and exports out of it.
Social
welfare. Welfare is a type of what? That's one of our things over here, G3. The government directly giving transfers to some households. That's one type of what? We have G3, G2, and G1. What else does the government do? They buy what? What do they buy? What's that? Goods and services, like weapons of mass destruction. Got to buy some bullets to kill the bad guys, right? So the government goes to private companies to buy weapons for national defense. So the government spends money that way. They also spend money on transfer payments like welfare, Social Security, unemployment claims, all kinds of different transfer programs. That's the Robin Hood concept of government. And lastly, they buy resources. There's people that need to scrub the toilets at the White House. Those people are paid a salary or an hourly rate. That's a different type of government spending. The government goes into the resource base, buys resources. So they're buying final products, they're buying resources, or they're just transferring funds between people. That's kind of the three lump sum places of spending. Now, how does that relate back to taxes then, to get back to this question? How do they become a net borrower? what's true about taxes and that spending? Taxes are less than that spending. Good. So taxes are a flow variable. For 2013, the government is just about darn near guaranteed not to collect enough taxes to pay for weapons of mass destruction, pay for transfer payments, and pay for the wage to the person who's scrubbing the toilets at the White House. Almost a virtual guarantee this year for 2013, similar to what it's been for the last 30, 40 years. The government's not collecting enough money in tax revenue. So if we take tax revenue collected, tax receipts, and we subtract off government spending, which you may affectionately remember from our cigarettes equation is G. Tax revenue collected is big T. If we take T minus G, it ends up being a negative number. But in general, that would be the amount of government saving. If government saving is a negative number, which it has been for the last 30 to 40 years, in other words, if government saving is less than 0 because T is bigger than G, or T is less than G, we have a government, not debt, but deficit. So that is dissaving. So we have what we call a deficit. And since we've kind of touched on this debt and deficit issue, deficit is the flow. The difference between these two flow variables gives you a net flow. Accumulated deficits over time creates a very large national debt. So note, accumulated deficits create a large debt. And there's the distinction between debt and deficit, which we'll come back to in chapter, way down the road, chapter 13. So accumulated deficits create a large debt. One thing I want to make sure you're clear on here, that'd be an extra note to this you can shove on somewhere. T is less than G. We're gonna look at some equations eventually, and so I want to have that in your notes. T is less than G. Tax revenues collected is less than government spending. All right. So here's the marketplace. We're going to look at the loanable funds market. The market for loanable funds. So we're measuring loanable funds here. And on the vertical axis, we're going to be measuring an interest rate. And that interest rate is going to be the real interest rate, which we'll note with a little r, little lowercase r. People who are on this side of the equation, do they like high interest rates or low interest rates? High, right? They want to get a nice rate of return for their money. So the people who are supplying loanable funds would like to see that interest rate high. If you are on the borrowing side, which most of you are likely, if you've got a little student loan going, meeting here today, if you're on this side, of course, you'd like low interest rates. And so you would like to borrow more funds, the demand for loanable funds, you would borrow more if it was cheaper to do so. So that sets up our two sides of the fence. The thing that's different about the loanable funds market is that all of our players are potentially on both sides. So go back and circle this net word. The reason I called that to your attention is that in the aggregate, these are usually going to be the businesses because they are net borrowers. So these are the firms or businesses. Same thing. Use those two words interchangeably, firms and business. And the supply of loanable funds in aggregate comes from households. The government's kind of a wild card, although they haven't been too wild in the United States. Have they been the demand side or the supply side for the last 30 to 40 years? The demand side. All right, we'll pick up there next time and kind of show the effects of the government entering the market for loanable funds.